You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet. A recent rape case in Delhi where a young woman was brutally sexually assaulted has shocked India and pushed the treatment of women to the top of the social agenda. The 23-year-old was travelling with a friend on a bus on her way home from the cinema when she was attacked, gang-raped and murdered. The incident has generated international coverage and was condemned by the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague is hosting a Preventing Sexual Violence initiative in London and says it's his personal priority during the UK's presidency of the G8 this year to secure new international action against the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war. And Labour MP Virendra Sharma has appealed for a debate on the horrific crime in Delhi, calling for greater protection for women across the world and that society at large must do more to protect women from violence in all its forms. With me in the studio is barrister Professor Jennifer Temkin and author of Rape and the Legal Process, Georgia Arlott, a journalist who travelled to India for her gap year and recently recounted her tale in response to the brutal rape and murder in Delhi. Over the phone from Delhi, we're joined by Ruchira Gupta, founder, president of Apne Aap Women Worldwide, which fights sex trafficking, and the Labour MP Virendra Sharma, who called for a debate on the brutal rape and murder of the 23-year-old in Delhi, and it's currently been signed by 66 MPs. First of all, why then, Mr. Sharma, have you appealed for this discussion?
This is an important issue, which is, I'm not saying ignored in the past, but certainly has highlighted in the last few months. And I think that it is the awareness and also to make sure that the British government and the British people also become part and parcel of any solution and protecting the women in the world.
Why did this attack that took place in Delhi spur you on to table this motion for a debate?
I mean, violence against women and children is very common in many parts of the world. It is happening daily and unfortunately all the political and professionals failed to tackle it in the past. This issue has highlighted through the media and for many other reasons has come on the forefront. And this is the way that everybody, not only me here, throughout the world, the people are awakening and they wanted to have a debate where how we can have the laws and the implementation of laws, but also changing the attitudes of the male chauvinism in the world.
So changing the attitude of the male chauvinism in the world, that's a big ask, I must say. But from Delhi then, Ruchira Gupta, what's your response to the fact that we've got a Labour MP in the UK who is calling for this debate on a global scale on male chauvinism and in response to the brutal attack in Delhi? What's the feeling in Delhi at the moment?
A lot of hope in Delhi because Justice Verma has come out with a report with recommendations for the government of India to implement, which range from tackling sex trafficking to more participation of women in politics to reducing sexual harassment in the workplace, and for police accountability as well. So we are very, very hopeful that these recommendations will be incorporated into law. And then, of course, the next phase of our movement will begin where we have to go to the streets to make sure that the law is implemented. I'm also thrilled that a Labour MP in UK has, and a male MP at that, has taken the lead in talking about sexual violence globally because what we find is that men are not our most reliable allies. They don't even understand when women are being discriminated. And we need a discussion and a dialogue on what is healthy masculinity. The notion of manhood, masculinity has got so distorted that now it is associated with domination and violence, whereas it can be about participation. So the fact that a Labour MP is talking about masculinity and the role of men is really important. And because UK and India have had such old ties and now more equal ties, and it's an Indian Labour MP, so I think this will also have a repercussion in India. So both things bring me hope.
Well, that's a positive response about the feeling of hope. But for the discussion, can you tell us a little bit about the culture in India and perhaps why rape is acknowledged, accepted, and happens every 4 seconds?
Yes, women are in danger from the time they are conceived till the time they are born, and more often inside the home than even on the streets. There's so much discrimination and bordering almost on misogyny. So when a girl child is conceived, then what happens is that she's very likely to be aborted just because she's a girl. If she is born, then she could be the victim of infanticide or femicide. Should she grow up a little bit in an average Indian family, it is very likely that her brother will be sent to school and she will be kept at home. And on top of that, she might be married very early, by the time she's 12, 13 or 14, as a child, and made to have a baby even before she herself has grown up fully. There's a huge amount of maternal mortality in India as well. And even then, there's the whole issue of dowry, where the girl has to bring in money into the boy's family to show, to add value to herself, because she is considered of lower value than the boy or the man. And there are hundreds of deaths, thousands of deaths if a girl does not bring in dowry enough. And then on top of that, if she becomes a child widow, then she's likely to be thrown out of the house and on the street so that she does not have to inherit property. And that is one route she could take. The other is, of course, that she could be trafficked into prostitution, into domestic servitude, and just because she has lesser options. Right from childhood, because she is not sent to school, because she's not given job training, because she's considered of lesser value, she becomes easy prey for traffickers. There are about 3 million women and girls who are trapped in prostitution in India today. And the average age of entry into prostitution is between 9 and 13 years old. And that means, and each girl is visited by about 10 customers a night, which means that about 30 million rapes are committed with impunity every night. And nobody talks about it because these are poor girls. These are girls. They are low caste, very often from minority groups, and nobody cares what happens to them. So in a culture where rape is so normalized, and people excuse the rape of these girls, and there's a culture of impunity, because people will say, oh, men will be men. And therefore, poor girls, low-caste girls and women have to be sexually available for upper-caste men. That culture is normalizing rapes across all levels. In my own work, I have been told repeatedly, not just that men will be men, but if prostitutes don't exist, then girls from good families will be raped. And this is horrifying, because it excuses men, and it also says that, some girls have to be available for some kind of unbridled male sexual desire.
You do present another word for it, a horrific culture towards the normalisation of rape. But I just want to bring the discussion back to my studio guests here, because Virendra Sharma, you mentioned the male chauvinism, and that obviously is a huge part of the culture in India. Georgia Arlott, you were on a gap year in India, and from this attack, you were inspired to write about your experiences. Can you tell us how you got on when you were travelling around?
Yes, my experiences thankfully do not compare to the appalling abuse suffered by that woman in Delhi. I can only talk about my own experiences, which were that I travelled around India with 3 female friends. We were always appropriately and modestly dressed in long-sleeve clothes and long trousers. And we found that sexual harassment was a daily occurrence. It was unavoidable for us. I'll give you an example. On our second day there, we piled into a rickshaw, 4 of us girls in a rickshaw, and I got into the front. And the taxi driver told me he was going to turn on the radio and promptly put his hand between my legs. And I was horrified, but that sort of thing happened daily to us, going swimming in the sea, fully clothed. We were followed in by 10 men who groped us, who surrounded us so that we couldn't get away from them. It was very frightening. And I have to say that, although I met very many protective, helpful men in India, my overriding feeling was of being very vulnerable and being very frightened as a woman. And I wouldn't recommend other women to travel in female groups or alone there. It certainly doesn't just happen to Western women, as we well know, but Western women do face real difficulties there. We met a group of some quite westernized men who'd been partly educated in America, who were Indian and from Bangalore, and they invited us to stay with them. We really trusted them. They had a female foreign exchange student with them, and we stayed with them, and they were certainly very protective and very kind to us. Staying in their house in the evenings, the police would arrive right on time at about 11:30 every night and demand a bribe. They would say that we were prostitutes. Of course, that wasn't the case, but that didn't seem to matter. So our friends would pay the bribe nightly, which was rather high, and made us feel incredibly guilty for accepting their hospitality. But it just goes to show that male and female friendship, it goes to show to me that that friendship is not valued or understood in India. You know, a basic friendship that is not built on sexual desire or exploitation.
Now, to bring you into the discussion, Professor Jennifer Temkin, there is still the social stigma of reporting rape.
Well, I don't think there's any room for complacency in the UK. It's true that the situation here doesn't in any sense resemble the terrible situation that we've just heard described in India, but certainly no room for complacency. We do know from an excellent statistical report that was issued by the Ministry of Justice in January that it is estimated that 85,000 women were, and I'm talking about adult women now, were the victims of rape in the last year, but only 16,000 actually reported it to the police. Now, clearly, although this is good, you know, this is an improvement, and gradually every year more and more women are coming forward. It's a courageous thing to do, and they are doing it. But you can see the huge gap between the numbers of reported rapes to the police and the numbers of rapes that are occurring. And that is perhaps telling us something about a certain lack of confidence that women have in the police force. And I'm afraid that, police response to rape in this country is very patchy. In some areas and with some forces it's excellent, but elsewhere, as we know from the Rochdale case, as we know also from the Savile case, frankly, it's not as good as it should be, despite years of training and etc. And if I can comment on the Indian situation too, we know, as we've just heard, that police have actually been implicated in rape in India. We know that police officers are actually carrying out rapes themselves and are actually involved in the trafficking of young girls. So education of the police, doing something about police attitudes, is actually very important over there and very important still over here.
Ruchira, why do you think that there has been a sort of culture of rape and the normalisation of rape in India that has perhaps got worse in the last few decades?
One is that there has been an increase in pornography, the use of pornography in India. And now pornography is coming to internet, blue movies, phone apps. Very recently there were BJP members of parliament who were watching pornography right inside the legislative assembly, members of the legislative assembly. And, it's become, and the narrative in the porn in India is basically, a woman being penetrated from every part of her body, crying and saying no, saying give me more. And this is exactly what a 12, 13, 15-year-old watches as their first encounter with sex. And they begin to believe that sex is connected to violence and domination. And I won't be surprised that the six rapists who killed Jyoti on 16 December in Delhi were probably used to watching porn videos in their basti together and actually began to imagine that sex was about that. And India has become the third largest user of pornography in the world. And also the maker of pornography. Many girls are being trafficked just for porn movies in small towns across India. the police is, of course, part of the problem. And what they do is they're users of porn, they're users of girls, they rape girls with impunity. If a girl tries to run away and go to them for help, they send her back to the brothels. In my own work, there have been times when I've tried to get a woman to seek justice by going to the police station. And normally the policeman himself, resorts to taking bribes from her at best, free sex from her at worst, and even raping her and sometimes sending her back to the brothel manager with whom he is in collusion with. And there is no way that we can hold a police officer accountable because the laws were made under colonial times in 1861 where, the police were meant to rule us as subjects, not as citizens. And I cannot complain against a police officer unless another officer accepts my complaint. Then the inquiry in India, the way the law is made, is done by another police officer and they will never investigate their own. There is no other mechanism for an ordinary Indian citizen to complain against the cops. And I have been dealing with such a case myself where an activist who works with my organization, Apne Aap, was trying to bust a trafficking ring. He gave a CD of a sting operation to a cop in Bihar. And the cop turned around and arrested him and the daughter of another activist, 14-year-old girl, and kept her in a police lockup all night. And we have been trying for 1 year to get the police officer suspended, and he's still at large, continuing as a big hero in the district.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. I'm joined by Professor Jennifer Temkin, journalist Georgia Arlott, Ruchira Gupta, founder-president of Apne Aap Women Worldwide, and the Labour MP Virendra Sharma.
First, that I agree with all the panel members, the way they have explained the situation, whether it is cultural, whether it is a system is so corrupt that there's very little chance of, at present, getting any justice. But what I see it as a person from the Indian background, a person who is now settled in Britain, but there's a huge Indian diaspora who have very close links with India, are very concerned. That's why there's a lot of demonstrations we all led here outside the Indian High Commission and other parts of the country. At the LSC, the students held a big meetings. What we as people living in Britain and the system in Britain can offer, the police can offer training, other ways. I got a lot of Indian police women who are here working as police officers, offered their services even to go to India and work closely with the Indian women police officers so that they are trained, they understand the ways to interview the women, those who've gone through this whole situation, how to give them the counseling, how to make sure that they come out and speak openly. There's many ways, and every individual have to play their part. One point which I feel that there is more need of more confidence building, as we cannot justify, there's no room for justification in any shape and form. As a member from New Delhi, she was saying that in her own caseload, there's individuals who has faced no cooperation from the system, which includes the police. We need to raise the awareness amongst the young generation who has the opportunities and have those resources available to them to understand the relationship between a man and a woman, the relationship to show respect to each other, and also the system in India and everywhere else need to look at showing the violence against women to the films and other places. They need to come out and raise the awareness and give the support to those people.
Professor Temkin, then, just what would your response be to Mr. Sharma?
Well, I think that we've heard that in India, a mammoth task is there, really. One just doesn't know, frankly, where to begin. And obviously the suggestions that he has made are very valuable. But I do think, looking back again to our experience here, what is so important here is that people should be held accountable. Those police officers, those members of local authorities who turned a blind eye, who knew, for example, about what was going on with Savile, who knew what was going on with those poor girls in Rochdale, who did nothing, they have to be held accountable. I think this is very, very important, and possibly in due course the BBC as well, quite apart from other things such as changes in the law, which we are seeing, incidentally, training, etc.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, where we're discussing the international reaction to a brutal rape in India. Taking part from Delhi is Ruchira Gupta, founder-president of Apne Aap Women Worldwide. Down the line from London, Labour MP Virendra Sharma. In the studio, Professor Jennifer Temkin from City University Law School, and Georgia Arlott, a journalist who travelled to India for her gap year and recently recounted her tale in response to the rape. Georgia, just on an emotional level then, what was it that compelled you to write this article?
I was obviously horrified by what happened in India and felt very engaged with the story because although I took away lots of wonderful things from my time in India, really one of the key things that I took away was that feeling of vulnerability, which I had been extremely fortunate not to have experienced ever in my time in England. And telling the story to parents, to adults, to older people. You know, I was 18 when I went there. And just seeing how shocked and horrified they were. And I wrote this story partly because I wanted other women who were thinking of travelling to India to know about this. I felt incredibly naive, in a sense, about what was awaiting me. And I know that my friends and I were very, very surprised by the treatment that we encountered there. And this girl's, this story of this girl certainly kind of flicked that switch for me of wanting to share what I'd been through, which was on a much lesser scale, but nevertheless tells you something.
Ruchira Gupta then, sort of Georgia highlighting her experiences in the British press in reaction to what happened, obviously, as she says, is minutiae in comparison to what this poor girl suffered. But in some way does shed light on the global reaction to what has taken place.
I think this is an opportunity for the women's movement to shame the government into doing something because otherwise, most of the politicians in parliament and in our legislatures are all men, and they're really extremely reluctant to tackle women's issues. So we need the world to keep watching and putting pressure and shaming our government. A lot of the politicians in the past have not just ignored rape, but mocked at the women and blamed the women for going out at night, for wearing the wrong kind of clothes, and what they term wrong kind of clothes, or for trying to be too bold, working, or whatever, and blaming the woman for becoming the victim of rape. In Calcutta, if you remember, there was another horrendous rape of a woman who was coming back from a nightclub, and the chief minister of that state said that, but why was a single woman going to a nightclub? The same thing happened when Jyoti was raped on the bus in December. The president's son is saying that dented and painted women are out protesting. So, always blaming the women, and the politicians were not willing to tackle this issue. This time they have had to tackle the issue for two reasons. One is that young people are marching on the streets incessantly, and they know it's election year and they'll have to count on the young person's vote. And the other is the international pressure in the media by things which are being launched by the Labour MP Virendra Sharma, etc. So I think this combination gives us an opportunity to bring about change and social transformation. So I do want this to continue.
I think that the person from New Delhi, she is right, that when the politicians, so-called the leading members of the community, some so-called the self-proclaimed gurus, they make such statements where it's, the young people need to come out, protest in a legal framework, but at the same time making sure that these people are publicly exposed, totally disgruntled in the community, so that they cannot come out and claim as the responsible people on behalf and speaking on behalf of the communities or the women or in the society in general. I think that there's a lot of changes coming. People are more aware. The young people from the universities and colleges, when they came out and protested against, is an encouraging point. But I think there is more need to be done. We will carry on in Britain to fight against that kind of nonsense in the society, making sure that we raise those issues and speak to the politicians whenever we meet. I was there only a few days ago when I was quoted in the media, when I was questioning people that what are you doing to protect the young generation. And also it is not only marginalizing, it is actually destroying a human being. And as she was saying earlier on, that this is the culture where right from the day one, even when a woman conceived the child and then they test whether it is a boy or the girl and the abortions taking place, we need to fight different corners where the women and the young children, young girls and the girls in the womb are protected.
Jennifer Temkin.
Well, obviously this discussion has been deeply distressing in terms of what we've heard about the condition of women in India and this constant harassment and oppression and discrimination against them. The most heartening thing has been the way that people have been willing to come out on the streets again and again to protest about these dreadful events. So I hope that they'll keep up the pressure and from that perhaps we'll see some good things emerging.
Ruchira Gupta, then, a final word from you and your response to what we've discussed today, and you feel a lot of hope. What's next in your campaign?
The next part of my campaign is to make sure that the Verma Commission recommendations are put into an act in Parliament, codified into law, and that the laws are not just applied for rich women or for upper class women and girls, but is applied universally for poor, low-caste girls. And we see no difference between commercial and non-commercial rape. And the fact that there's violence to women inside brothels is equally bad as violence to women outside the brothels. And that laws need to apply, and the police needs to be accountable, and politicians need to be accountable to all women and girls.
And finally, from you, Georgia Arlott, what have you taken from today's discussion?
I'd certainly love to continue to write and hear about this sort of thing. I certainly agree it's been a distressing conversation, but here we are talking about it on radio. What we've heard is that this is a difficult subject to talk about, sometimes a subject that people are not allowed to talk about. And if these conversations can go on in every country in the world, and crucially in India, then there is hope.
I'd like to thank all my guests from Delhi: women's rights campaigner Ruchira Gupta, journalist Georgia Arlott, Professor Jennifer Temkin from City University, and Labour MP Virendra Sharma.